Hey guys, it's Sublime Tales, bringing you the best of Reddit stories. Hit that like and subscribe button for more stories. The time I got stranded on a mountain with no signal. This happened a couple of years ago, but it still crosses my mind now and then, especially when I'm out in nature. I've always loved hiking, but I'm not what you'd call a thrill seeker. For me, hiking has always been about the peace, the quiet, and the chance to disconnect from the daily grind. There's something about walking through the woods with only the sound of your footsteps and the rustling leaves that gives me a sense of clarity. But this particular hike, one I'll never forget, took a much darker turn. It was a late September weekend, the kind where the summer heat had finally started to give way to the cool, crisp air of autumn. The leaves were just beginning to change, but the weather was still warm enough that hiking in a t-shirt was comfortable. I figured it was the perfect time for a day hike, nothing too strenuous, just a few hours in nature to clear my head and get some exercise. I'd done plenty of hikes around the area before, but I wanted to try something new. I found a trail online in a national park about 3 hours from where I lived. It was rated as moderate, with good reviews and promises of stunning views at the summit. It seemed perfect. I packed my usual gear, a water bottle, some energy bars, a light jacket, a map, and my fully charged phone. I'm not the kind of person who checks my phone much while hiking, but I always bring it along for emergencies. I hadn't planned on anything going wrong that day, and I certainly didn't expect that I'd be needing it as much as I did. The drive to the national park was uneventful. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky, and there were a few other cars in the parking lot. I saw a couple of people gearing up for what looked like an overnight backpacking trip, but for the most part, it seemed quiet. The first few miles of the trail were easy. The path was wide, well marked, and the forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional scurrying of small animals. I was in my element, feeling the usual calm that comes from being out in nature. The towering trees, the smell of pine, the gentle breeze, everything was just as I'd hoped. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the trail started to narrow, but it was still easy to follow. I passed a few other hikers along the way, exchanging nods and the occasional hello, but after a while, I found myself completely alone. That's when I started to notice how quiet it was. The further I got from the trailhead, the less noise I heard. The birdsong faded, and the wind seemed to die down. It was just me, the trail, and the steady sound of my footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. By the time I reached the halfway point, a lookout with a breathtaking view of the valley below, I felt great. I stopped for a while to take it all in, pulling out my phone to snap a few photos. The signal was weak, but I didn't think much of it. I'd expected to lose service out here in the middle of the national park. After a quick snack, I decided to continue. The trail looped around from this point, leading back to the parking lot in a large, sweeping arc. According to the map, it should have taken me about another 2 hours to make the full loop, which would give me plenty of time to get back before sunset. That's when things started to go wrong. About 30 minutes after leaving the lookout, I reached a fork in the trail. There were two paths, and both were marked with faded signs that were barely legible. I squinted at them, trying to decipher the weather-worn lettering, and I was pretty sure I recognized the name of the trail on the right. The other trail looked less traveled, with grass and weeds encroaching on the path. I figured the right path was the correct one, so I turned and started walking. For a while, everything seemed fine. The path was clear enough, though it did start to narrow even more as I went on. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the ground grew rockier, but I didn't think too much of it. I assumed it was just part of the terrain. I kept checking my map, but without cell service, it was hard to tell exactly where I was. After another 20 minutes or so, I noticed that the trail was getting steeper. The gentle incline had become much more pronounced, and the path had nearly disappeared altogether. I paused, glancing around, starting to feel a creeping sense of unease. The terrain didn't match what I remembered from the map, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in the wrong direction. I stopped, pulling out my phone again in the hopes that I might get some signal. Still nothing. The screen showed no bars, just a blank no service icon at the top. I wasn't panicking yet, but the sense of unease was growing. I tried to remember how far back the last marker had been, but I couldn't recall seeing one for a while. I decided to turn back and retrace my steps, but that's when things started to get even weirder. As I walked back, the trail seemed different. I'd been careful to pay attention to the landmarks on my way in, a twisted tree here, a large rock there, but now those landmarks were nowhere to be seen. The trees all looked the same, and the path seemed to be fading into the forest. I hadn't seen anyone else for a while, and the realization that I was completely alone began to sink in. I tried to keep my cool. I'd been hiking for years, and I knew that getting lost was always a possibility. I figured I'd just walk back the way I came until I hit the main trail again. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The forest was dense, and the trail was barely visible under the layer of fallen leaves. It didn't help that the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The soft afternoon light was giving way to the golden hues of early evening, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I needed to find my way back, fast. By now, it had been over an hour since I first realized I was lost. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I had no signal, no clear idea of where I was, and no one knew I was off the main trail. I cursed myself for not being more cautious, for not double-checking the signs at the fork. As the sun continued to sink below the trees, the temperature dropped noticeably. I hadn't prepared for an overnight stay. All I had was a light jacket, a couple of granola bars, and a bottle of water. I was in no immediate danger, but the thought of spending the night alone in the forest with no way to contact anyone was terrifying. I tried shouting for help a few times, hoping that maybe there were other hikers nearby, but all I got in return was the echo of my own voice. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, and every rustle of leaves sent a chill down my spine. When the last light finally faded, I had no choice but to stop. I knew wandering around in the dark would only make things worse. I found a small clearing near a large tree and sat down, trying to keep warm. I pulled out my phone again, but there was still no signal. The battery was down to 50%, so I decided to conserve it, only using the flashlight when absolutely necessary. The night was colder than I had anticipated. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't do much to keep out the chill. Every so often, I'd hear a noise, a rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig, and my imagination would run wild. Was it just an animal? Or something else? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but being alone in the dark messes with your mind. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow more sinister. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if I couldn't find my way back tomorrow? What if I wandered even further off the trail? What if no one came looking for me? By the time the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees, I was exhausted but relieved. The forest looked less threatening in the daylight, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. I knew I needed to move, to find my way back before my situation got any worse. I remembered reading somewhere that following water was a good strategy if you were lost. Water sources often lead to larger trails or populated areas. I hadn't seen any streams nearby, but I knew that if I headed downhill, I'd eventually find one. I started walking again, keeping my pace slow and deliberate. I didn't want to rush and miss something important. After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally heard it, the faint sound of running water. I followed the sound until I reached a small stream, winding its way through the forest. I was tired, but hearing the sound of water gave me a second wind. The stream was small, no more than a few feet wide, but it was enough to reignite my hope. I knew that streams often led to rivers, and rivers led to civilization or at least more established trails. I carefully followed the stream, making sure to keep it in sight as I weaved through the trees. After about an hour of walking, I started to notice subtle signs of human activity. A footprint here, a broken branch there. These were good signs, and I felt my anxiety slowly give way to a cautious optimism. I still hadn't seen another person, but I knew I was on the right track. Then, finally, I saw it, a wooden trail marker, weathered and covered in moss but unmistakably human-made. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. I had found a trail. This one was much wider and more well-worn than the one I had been on before, and I immediately knew it was the main path. Relief washed over me as I realized I wasn't lost anymore. I followed the trail for another mile or so before I saw the best sight I'd seen in over 24 hours, other hikers. A small group of 3, dressed in bright hiking gear, appeared on the trail ahead of me. As I approached, I must have looked disheveled, and they immediately asked if I was okay. I told them what had happened, how I'd taken a wrong turn and gotten lost. And they were kind enough to offer me some water and even a portable phone charger so I could send a quick message to a friend letting them know I was safe. They walked with me for the last leg of the trail, and as we chatted, I learned that they had camped out overnight and were on their way back to the trailhead. I didn't tell them how scared I had been or how close I came to giving up. I think they could tell from my expression that it had been a rough night. When we finally reached the trailhead and I saw my car, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, gratitude. I thanked the hikers profusely and made a mental note to pay it forward if I ever came across a lost hiker in the future. I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. I didn't want to rush back to normal life right away. I needed to process everything that had happened. I realized how close I'd come to a potentially dangerous situation and how easily things could have gone worse. All because of one wrong turn and a few bad decisions. Looking back, the whole experience taught me a few valuable lessons about hiking, and about life. First and foremost, never underestimate the wilderness. Even if you think you know what you're doing, nature has a way of humbling you quickly. Always be prepared for the unexpected. I've since invested in a proper GPS device that doesn't rely on cell service, and I always make sure to tell someone exactly which trail I'll be on before heading out. I also learned that it's okay to ask for help. The hikers I met at the end of my ordeal were incredibly kind, and without them, I might have spent even more time lost in the woods. If you're ever in a situation like that, don't be too proud or embarrassed to reach out to others. The experience didn't stop me from hiking, but it did make me more cautious. These days, I'm much more meticulous about planning my trips and making sure I have everything I need to stay safe. I no longer take the wilderness for granted, and I'm always aware of how quickly things can change out there. I still think about that night in the forest sometimes, the cold, the darkness, the fear. But I also remember the relief of finding my way back, the kindness of strangers, and the sense of accomplishment I felt when I finally reached safety. It's a story I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of my own resilience and the importance of preparation. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed these Reddit stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.